we're diving into GEN3C, a cutting-edge model that finally gives AI precise camera control and rock-solid 3D consistency in video generation. Most AI video tools struggle with objects popping in and out of existence or camera movements that feel like a wild roller coaster ride. But GEN3C fixes this with a 3D cache, a secret memory of the scene built from depth predictions. Whether it's smooth driving simulations, cinematic effects like dolly zoom, or editing objects in a scene, this model brings Hollywood magic to AI video generation. Stick around as we break down how this works. Let's get started!
In video generation, how do you keep things consistent in 3D space? Many of today's video models can produce very impressive results, but they often struggle with sudden changes, like objects disappearing or popping in unexpectedly, because they don't fully understand the 3D scene. Another sticking point is camera control. Most methods treat camera movement as just another input, leaving the model to guess how the scene should change when the camera shifts. GEN3C addresses these issues by relying on a 3D cache. Think of it like a memory bank of point clouds, extracted from depth predictions of seed images or past frames. Whenever GEN3C needs to generate a new frame, it looks at 2D renderings of this cache and transforms them according to the user's chosen camera movements. This way, GEN3C focuses on only the new parts of the scene rather than constantly rebuilding what it already knows. Want to see the result? Look at Figure 1 here. You'll notice smoother, more stable videos that let you precisely control the camera. You can do novel view synthesis or create dynamic driving scenes. You can even pull off a dolly zoom effect, where the camera moves closer while zooming out to create that dramatic shifting background. This progress benefits several fields, including computer graphics, autonomous driving, and movie production. So how does GEN3C keep things consistent across frames? If you move a camera around a scene and then reverse your path, most models can't remember what was there before. They introduce flicker or cause objects to shift. Take a look at Figure 2 here to see exactly what that looks like with older methods. GEN3C, by contrast, explicitly stores 3D geometry using a point cloud. The process is straightforward. It predicts the depth of each frame or seed image, and then reconstructs a 3D version of the scene, which it uses as a cache for future frames. When you direct the camera to a new angle, GEN3C simply re-renders that 3D cache, rather than guessing how the scene should look. The result is smoother videos and fewer artifacts. Since this 3D cache precisely models the scene, you can also edit it by removing objects or rearranging the layout. It even supports camera movements that yield near photorealistic accuracy. But how does GEN3C compare to what's already out there? Novel View Synthesis, or NVS, has made huge leaps. But many NVS methods depend on lots of input images, or they break down with extreme camera angles. Recent approaches that tap into large-scale image and video generation models still struggle with efficiency or robustness. GEN3C builds on these advances, offering a practical way to keep scenes consistent and to precisely control the camera in video synthesis. Controlling the camera while maintaining consistency over time is especially tricky. Early efforts tried feeding camera parameters directly to the model, but that often failed for new motions. Depth warping approaches aimed to align the frames, yet they often created inconsistencies when merging warped frames with generated outputs. GEN3C does something different. It uses 3D guidance. First, it builds a 3D cache from your input images or previous video frames. This cache holds depth and spatial details. When it's time to generate a new frame, the model re-renders the cache from the user's chosen viewpoint. No more guessing. Figure 3 here shows how it all fits together. The input can be just one image, multiple images, or even a dynamic video. GEN3C estimates depth, creates a spatio-temporal 3D cache, and re-renders this cache from new angles based on camera instructions. After that, a video diffusion model refines these re-rendered frames into realistic outputs. Speaking of video diffusion models, these models learn by gradually adding noise to data and then removing it. By training on large video datasets, they become experts at predicting how a clean video should look, even from messy inputs. GEN3C builds on a pre-trained, stable video diffusion model, which compresses everything into a more manageable latent space. Altogether, these elements let GEN3C achieve precise camera control with high temporal consistency. That makes it far more robust than older methods. Now, building high-quality videos from multiple viewpoints brings another set of hurdles. Depth estimates can be noisy, and lighting can vary by viewpoint. GEN3C tackles this by creating a spatio-temporal 3D cache, a structured memory that updates over time. How does this cache come together? The model takes an RGB image, predicts depth, and then unprojects each pixel into a 3D point cloud. If you have more than one view, each view feeds its own entry into the 3D cache, which is then spread over time for video generation. If your scene is dynamic, the cache can be built from an initial set of synchronized videos, so the system works across various scenarios. Once the 3D cache is ready, the model renders it from your chosen camera angles, using something called Gaussian splats. Sometimes you'll have gaps or mismatches though. Check out figure 4 here to see 3 different ways of merging multiple views. The naive approach, directly blending images, often leads to blurring. Another method concatenates latent representations, but still leaves inconsistencies. GEN3C solves this by masking out unreliable areas and fusing multiple viewpoints in a way that promotes consistency. Finally, the fused result heads to the video diffusion model. During training, the model processes the rendered video, encodes it in a latent space, and masks out parts of the scene that the 3D cache didn't cover. Then it blends that masked representation with a noisy version of the target video in the diffusion steps. If there are multiple viewpoints, it processes each one separately and uses max pooling to pick the most reliable information. This approach preserves both spatial and temporal coherence. When it's done, GEN3C can produce videos that stay consistent across various camera angles, retaining fine details for a more believable, 3D-aware video. So how does GEN3C keep everything consistent during fusion without causing visual artifacts? Directly combining 3D point clouds can be risky because it relies on perfect depth alignment. Other methods concatenate viewpoints into a single block of data, but that forces a fixed number of viewpoints and imposes an order. GEN3C bypasses these issues with a permutation invariant fusion strategy. This means it can handle any number of viewpoints no matter the order. Masking also plays a big role. Instead of introducing extra trainable parameters by concatenating a mask, GEN3C applies the mask directly to the latent representations. That keeps the model architecture the same and improves generalization. How does GEN3C learn all this? Training pairs the 3D cache renderings with real videos under known camera trajectories. The video diffusion model then predicts how those rendered frames can become realistic video. The first frame is also encoded by a vision model called clip to give some extra context. When it's time to generate videos, GEN3C starts with pure noise and refines that noise into a final video, one step at a time. Making a 14-frame video takes about 30 seconds on an NVIDIA A100 GPU. For longer videos, GEN3C updates the 3D cache in stages. Instead of generating everything in one shot, it splits the process into overlapping chunks, updating the cache as it goes. This approach keeps transitions smooth and avoids letting small mistakes pile up. By aligning each new depth estimate with the existing 3D cache, the model maintains natural-looking scenes, even in lengthy sequences. It's one thing to generate neat videos from well-aligned input views, but real-world data is often sparse and messy. Check out figure 6 here. When comparing GEN3C with methods like Pixel Splat and MV Splat, you'll see that GEN3C produces smoother, more plausible transitions, especially when the input views have limited overlap. This is a big deal for handling challenging scenarios where you only have a few angles of the same scene. For a fair evaluation, GEN3C was tested on multiple datasets. A huge obstacle is that most multi-view, real-world video datasets lack both 3D scene info and ground truth videos from multiple viewpoints. The researchers got around this by mixing real-world static videos with synthetic multi-view data, which taught GEN3C to preserve both spatial and temporal consistency. Now look at Table 1. It compares GEN3C to 4 strong baselines across 2 datasets, REI0K, which is in domain, and tanks and temples, which is out of domain. GEN3C outperforms them all. Higher peak signal-to-noise ratio, or PSNR, and structural similarity index measure, or SSIM, mean sharper, more structurally accurate outputs. Lower learned perceptual image patch similarity, or LPIPS, means the generated frames look more like real images to the human eye. And GEN3C's temporal stability error distance, TSED, is significantly lower, confirming better temporal consistency. To build a 3D cache for training, the researchers carefully selected camera viewpoints, so the model would learn to fill in the gaps for missing frames. Through simulated viewpoint changes, GEN3C learned to handle unseen perspectives and still produce consistent results. And for generating a full video from a single image, GEN3C does the same dance. It estimates depth, builds a 3D cache, and uses a diffusion model for final rendering. Compare it to GenWarp or camera CTRL using the same depth info, and Gen3C wins on stability and camera consistency. That confirms Gen3C's unique pipeline is what makes the difference, not just better inputs. Ever try making realistic novel views from just a couple of images? It's tough, especially in motion-heavy settings like driving. Look at Figure 7 here. When the camera shifts dramatically up, down, or sideways, other methods leave blurry patches or distorted areas where they can't fill in missing details. Gen3C, on the other hand, manages to reconstruct those blank spots with surprisingly good quality. Table 2 shows this numerically. Listen. With only 2 images, Gen3C gets sharper, more realistic novel views than Pixel Splat and MV Splat. It achieves the highest PSNR and SSIM, meaning it's closer to the real images, and the lowest LPIPS, meaning better perceptual quality. Now consider self-driving scenarios, where you need to generate new perspectives for training. Look at Table 3. It uses the Frechet Inception Distance, FID, to assess realism. Lower scores are better. Gen3C significantly outperforms the baselines, especially for viewpoints far from the original trajectory. That's a huge plus for autonomous driving, where anticipating unseen angles is critical. How does Gen3C pull this off with just 2 input views? First, it estimates their depth, builds a 3D cache, and renders multiple viewpoints. Then it feeds those renderings into the video diffusion model. Better yet, it can handle more than 2 views if you have them, which makes it really flexible. In tests, the researchers looked at 40 sequences from both the REI0K and Tanks and Temples datasets, and Gen3C again outperformed the competition. So it's not just good at filling in small gaps, it does well on bigger viewpoint shifts too. Looking forward, Gen3C is making waves in simulated driving environments, which is a critical step for developing robust self-driving systems. By producing realistic driving videos from diverse camera angles, it reduces the need for massive amounts of real-world data. But Gen3C isn't just a tool for making new views. It can edit 3D scenes too. Figure 8 here shows an example where Gen3C removes cars from a driving scene and re-simulates a realistic version of that environment. This is possible because the 3D cache stores detailed spatial information, so any edits feel more natural. For monocular dynamic novel view synthesis, Figure 9 demonstrates how Gen3C can take a single video and re-render it from an entirely different camera path. Notice how it correctly adjusts the depth of field when zooming out. That's proof of its solid 3D understanding. Then we have Figure 10, where Gen3C's adaptive fusion strategy goes head-to-head with explicit fusion, merging point clouds directly. Explicit fusion often stumbles with misalignments in depth and lighting, resulting in messy outputs. Gen3C's method produces cleaner, more lifelike frames. Now let's look at a few tables. Table 4 compares Gen3C to GCD on dynamic view synthesis, and you'll see a big improvement in FID, 98.58 versus 150.64. Table 5 measures how well Gen3C holds up under noisy depth estimates. Even with 30% noise, it delivers strong results, proving it can deal with imperfect data. And in Table 6, we compared different fusion strategies. Explicit fusion leads to blurrier images, while Gen3C's approach yields sharper, steadier views. Does it generalize? Absolutely. Tests on Sora and MovieGen-generated videos show Gen3C can maintain 3D structure and match camera motion, even beyond the data it was trained on. Finally, an ablation study breaks down 2 big things: how Gen3C fuses the 3D cache and how it handles noisy depth. Those tests confirm that its design choices boost both realism and stability. So what happens if you hook Gen3C up to an even more advanced video diffusion model? Look at Figure 11 here to compare stable video diffusion to a model called Cosmos. The takeaway? When using Cosmos, Gen3C generates cleaner videos with fewer artifacts. The stronger the base model, the better the outcome. Check out Figure 12 next. It shows Gen3C handling large camera rotations, pivoting the scene extensively left and right. This isn't a small tweak in perspective. Gen3C is fully capable of generating new viewpoints, even ones that deviate dramatically from the original input. Of course, real-world depth estimates are never perfect. To see how Gen3C copes with errors, the team artificially added noise to the depth predictions. Good news, even with 30% noise, it still produces coherent videos. That's great for practical scenarios where depth estimates aren't exact. Beyond that, the paper explores how Gen3C adapts to new generation video diffusion models. They replaced stable video diffusion with Cosmos, a model known for higher quality video generation. The training process remained pretty much the same. Cosmos was fine-tuned for 10,000 steps using datasets like REI0K, and DL3DV. This points to a clear conclusion. Gen3C isn't locked to a single pipeline. As more powerful diffusion models come along, Gen3C can incorporate them with minimal extra work. That opens the door for consistent improvements in video generation. In the end, Gen3C accomplishes its goals by building a 3D cache, guiding the camera precisely, and hitting state-of-the-art results in novel view synthesis. One known limitation is that it relies on pre-generated videos for motion. Future directions might integrate text prompts to guide motion, which would be a neat way to expand AI-driven video creation. Thanks for joining us today. Happy learning and stretching together.